Hello, and welcome to another episode of DVD Graveyard. Tonight we're going to be taking a look at Texas Chainsaw 3D, or just Texas Chainsaw, as you know my DVD copy says, or a lot of the home releases say, I suppose. From 2013, it is the seventh installment in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre series, and this one was released by Lionsgate. And um, I just picked this one kind of randomly, just because I'd watched it the other day. Um, because I remember when this was in theaters. I remember when it came out. I remember seeing all the trailers for it. I think I was still in high school. My very last year of high school, if I'm not mistaken. And I just remember seeing the trailers come out, and I was like, "Oh, this is badass! There's another Texas Chainsaw movie, coming out." I was super excited. At the time, I mean, I still am a big Texas Chainsaw Massacre fan, especially the first movie. The nothing to me will ever top that first film. A lot of the sequels I do enjoy, and I've covered them on this channel before, but I'll most likely go back and redo some of those, especially the first one, because I have a lot more that I'd like to say about it, and I'd like to really kind of dive into that one. But I love that one. I love the second one, for different reasons, but again, it's definitely not as great as the first one. The third one's hit or miss. The Next Generation I really like for just silly, goofy reasons. And the remakes are fine. I enjoy those, especially the 2003 remake. And so this was the first one to really come along in 10 years. At this point, like I said, this one came out in 2013, and it would be I don't have the exact year apart, but it's 40ish years removed from the original film that came out in 1974. And like I said, when this came out, I was super hyped to see it. And I was pumped. I wanted to go to the theaters. I had a friend that worked at the movies, and he said that he had kind of walked into one of the theaters and saw a little bit of it. And I was super excited. I wanted to see it so bad. And when it finally came out on DVD, I didn't see it. I think it, like I said, came out in January or February of that year. I didn't see it till June. I think I still have my receipt in this. I keep most of my receipts, and sorry, I keep bumping that thing, but so my receipt, I bought it around June, and I still remember buying it. I bought it at Walmart, and I went in, and it had finally come out. That was back when it took a while for DVD, the movie to come out on DVD, but it was getting a little bit more, quicker. Now you can literally go see the movie. I think even Wolfman is about to be released, on physical media, and I know Nosferatu is definitely about to, and that just came out, in December, at the very end of December. So it doesn't take long, but back in this time, 2013, 2012, in that era, it took a minute for them to kind of get released to DVD. And when I first watched it, I was actually really disappointed, and I thought it was really dumb and silly, and it still is dumb and silly, but I've come to really enjoy it over, for its own reasons. I have problems with it, but there's also things that I really enjoy about it, and it's very nostalgic for me, and I find myself putting it in a lot, as far as like the sequels are concerned. Like I watched the first one, you know, at least 2 or 3 times a year. I'll watch that movie because it's one of my favorite horror movies of all time. And as for the sequels, I find myself going back to this one, a lot more often than I kind of would have expected. I know that sounds crazy, but it's just a goofy, fun time. And that's not to say that it's one of the best in the series by any means. I did a ranking, but just it's just a fun watch for me. And I have problems with it, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about here. So first, I'm gonna read the synopsis off the back of the DVD here. So, Texas Chainsaw continues the legendary story of the homicidal Sawyer family, picking up where Toby Hooper's 1974 horror classic left off in Newt, Texas, where 4 decades people went missing without a trace. Decades later, and hundreds of miles away from the original massacre, a young woman named Heather learns that's Alexandra Daddario learns that she has inherited a Texas estate from a grandmother she never knew she had. After embarking on a road trip with her friends, she uncovers her roots. She finds she is the sole owner of a lavish, isolated Victorian mansion, but her newfound wealth comes at a price as she stumbles upon a horror that awaits her in the mansion's cellars. Dun dun dun. That Texas Chainsaw Massacre sound. That's what we'll throw in there. But yeah, so that's kind of the basic plot synopsis. And yeah, so we'll just kind of get into it. But anyway, so Texas Chainsaw 3D. This was 3D in the theaters again, like I said, but I've never watched it in 3D. So this one was directed by John Lusenhop, I believe is how you say his name, and it was written by Adam Marcus, Deborah Sullivan, and Kirsten. Wait, what is her name? Kirsten Sims, I think. Sorry, I can't really read my handwriting on her. I was writing it really quick. But anyway, so and it has Alexandra Diodario who plays Heather, Trey Songs who plays Ryan, Tanya Raymond. Sorry, I don't know why I said that weird. Nikki, she plays Nikki. Karam, I'm butchering these names. I'm so sorry. Karam Sanchez, who plays Kenny, and then of course we do get. Oh yeah, sorry, I should probably throw these in there. Tom Barry is Sheriff Hooper, and then Dan Yeager plays Leatherface, who we find is well, I'm not going to spoil that just yet. I'll get into that. And then of course we get Marilyn Burns in this in a cameo, not a cameo, but she's in this, playing a character, and then we get. Oh my goodness, Bill Moseley. He plays Drayton Sawyer, and then we also see oh my goodness, Gunnar Hansen is in this. He's kind of playing a background character, which I always thought was funny, because they could never get him to come back for any of the sequels to actually play Leatherface, because for financial reasons. But in this, he's in this one, but he's not playing Leatherface. He's playing another family member, and of course we get John Dugan, who played Grandpa in the original, but he comes back and plays Grandpa in this, which I thought was really awesome that he was in this. So there's a lot of fan service in this, and I do appreciate it in this movie, because they don't go overboard with it. They don't go, it's not like the 2022 Texas Chainsaw Massacre where they're just like spoon feeding you, fan service. That I didn't care for. Well, maybe we'll talk about that one eventually. But this one pretty much it starts out right where we leave off in 1974 with Sally, in the back of the truck, leaving, and it's just a recap shot of what's going on, and then we go into a kind of a flashback sequence that is filmed in modern day, kind of like they did with Halloween Kills, and so that's when we meet Sheriff Hooper, and he basically goes to the Sawyer house, and it's this beautiful recreation of the original house. It looks amazing. It is almost indistinguishable from the original house, and it looks great. And they've tried really hard, and they did a decent job of recapturing that feel. I mean, they're never gonna get that ever again. But it feels fine. You know what I mean? Like it works fine. Just like again, like I said with Halloween Kills, their flashback sequence, it worked perfectly fine. It felt like it fit. The film, kind of what they were going for. It fit that really well, and I think that they did fine on this. And of course, we meet Bill Moseley, who plays Drayton Sawyer, and we see Leatherface, and he's still in the Pretty Woman, get up, and it just looks great. I really wish Gunnar Hansen could have played Leatherface just for that flashback sequence. I think that would have been great, but he didn't. But he is in the house, and then basically, Sheriff Hooper is outside, and he's like, send out Jed, and so that is Leatherface's name, is Jedediah Sawyer. They must have liked that name because they used that name in the 2003 remake for that little boy that's out there. So I thought that was really interesting that they put that in there, and I like that they brought the name Drayton back for the character of the cook, who of course it was Jim Cito, and he's passed away now. But I like that they brought Bill Moseley in to play this character. I thought that worked out really well. But anyway, so while they're kind of talking, they're kind of having this standoff from inside the house. The family's inside the house, and Sheriff Hooper's in the yard, and he's talking, over the loudspeaker, and he's telling them to basically give up Jed, and the family's like, just, Gunnar Hansen, give him the boy, and so they're like, we're gonna send out Jed, everything's gonna be fine, it is what it is, blah blah blah. He gets a good lawyer. So before they can actually send Leatherface out there, a whole group of just these kind of hillbilly, this hillbilly militia kind of group shows up, and it's led by Bert Hartman, who is Paul Ray, and he becomes important later on as well. But so they pull up, and he is basically saying, we need to just kill him, we need to string him up for dead, we need to burn the house down, and so he kind of incites this this group of people that comes with him, and they Molotov cocktail the house, and they just start opening fire, and they kill everyone inside. Very much kind of like the Devil's Rejects, which this movie again sort of I'll get into it, but it kind of leans not just with this scene, but it tries to do something that Devil's Rejects did really well, but it does not work in this movie. And again, we'll get into that. But basically, they burn the house down. There's the whole family dies, and Hooper kind of confronts Hartman, and he pushes him, and he's like, what the hell, this is crazy, blah blah blah. And so Bert tells him, he's like, can't get around the good book, Sheriff. That was justice. We did justice to these people. And and he truly wasn't wrong. I mean, he burned down a house of mass murderers. And I mean, I get that everybody kind of deserves their day in court or whatever, but at the same time, homie in there is wearing a person's face, and they've literally been eating people. So I mean, it's and it was 1974. So I think that was a little silly, but what they're gonna do. I'll get into that, like I said, later. So then we get the opening. Then we get the opening credits. Comes out Texas Chainsaw, and it's this awful 3D CGI kind of 3D thing that sets up the the Texas Chainsaw 3D aspect of it, I guess, and it looks terrible. It's crap. And so when we come out of that little opening sequence, we go to like a supermarket, and that's where we meet Alexandra Daddario, who is Heather. And I forgot to mention something, by the way. I completely forgot about this. So after the house is burned, and after their Sheriff Hartman, Hooper confronts Hartman. We find this man, and he is basically looking around this burn site, and he finds a woman with a little baby. And so he picks up the baby, and the baby has this little burn mark on her chest, from this necklace that the woman was wearing, with an S for Sawyer. And so he gets the baby and then kicks the lady in the face, and I guess just kills her, on the spot. Takes the baby back to the truck and puts it in the truck, and he's like, "I got it for us. We've got a baby." Arlene, I think, is her name. I should have written their names down, but I forgot, so I apologize. Again, it'll come important later. And that's whenever we get the opening credits, and that's when we meet Heather, who Heather, like I said, is it's Alexandra Daddario, and this movie is supposed to be, again, 40-something years later. So she is the youngest looking, almost 50-year-old woman, or however old she's supposed to be exactly. She's the youngest one I've ever seen. She's definitely not in her 20s at all. And she is a butcher. She's working in the meat department at this grocery store. And then she goes out and she talks with her friend Nikki. That's where we meet. So we meet her, Tanya Raymond. So they are talking about this trip that they're going to go on to New Orleans later, and they're talking about this girl that she had just hooked Nikki up with, which was Kenny. And so after that, we end up getting back to Heather's apartment where she's making some bone art. And this was before everybody making bone art was really cool. This was whenever it was, I guess, still kind of weird, or it was getting into it, but it was still a little risque. So you're just like, oh, this hot chick's making stuff out of bones. That's different. So that was kind of leaning into her character. And that's when we meet Matt, Trey Songz. I'm sorry, not Matt, Ryan is his name. I don't know why I said Matt. But that's where we meet Ryan, who is her boyfriend, played by Trey Songz. And they basically starts kind of getting all hot and heavy, and they're about to kind of mess around, and that's when we see the birthmark on Heather's chest, and that's whenever the connection is made that, oh, she was the baby. And so then they get somebody rings the doorbell and stops them from getting it on right there on the couch, unfortunately, like they wanted to. Damn, I could have went for some of that sexy Alexandra Daddario time, but sorry. Anyway, so they go, and that's when Heather gets a letter that says that her grandmother's passed away, and that she basically has to go to Texas, go to New Texas to deal with some stuff. And so that's when we meet Heather's parents, who are these people from the original flashback, and they're really shitty. They're terrible. That's when they tell her she's adopted, and they're like, I guess she's asking them about it, and she's like, no, you don't want to go down there. You don't want to go to Texas. And they're just being awful to her and really shitty, and like, if we had half a mind, we would have just left you back there. And the mom is like, oh, you're lucky that we're the ones that raised you. Those people were, I just can't even put that into words. Those people were awful, terrible people, blah, blah, blah. And again, she's not wrong, but, Heather gets pissed. She storms out. her mom's just telling her, don't go to Texas, don't go to Texas. So of course, when she gets back at the apartment, that's when Nikki and Kenny show up, and they tell, and of course Ryan is there, and they're all like, of course we're gonna go to Texas with you, we're gonna go resolve this, and yada yada yada. So then we get on the road, and they're in a VW van, driving. I'm pretty sure it's the same van that was in the '74 film, if I'm not mistaken. It looks almost just like it, just a different color. I don't know if it's the same model, but it looks just like it. And they're playing some like rap music, which I don't have any problem with rap music at all. But for some reason it just does not fit in this movie. I don't know. It's again same thing with the 2022 Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's like some trap music in there, and like that's one thing I never needed in a Texas Chainsaw movie was trap music, But again, I have nothing against rap music, at all. But it's just I don't know. It was just kind of off putting. I was like, that's weird to hear that, especially and that's even not really a bother now. But it was back then. I was in my head. I was just like, that's odd to hear that in a Texas Chainsaw movie for some reason. And so then we get to, it's basically pouring down rain, and we're at this gas station, and they're going in there and they're getting a bunch of snacks and stuff. And then when they come out to leave, they run over this guy, and he gets back up, and he's like, oh, I'm Daryl, I should probably sue you, but I'll settle for a stick of that beef jerky. And they're like, well, where are you going? And he tells them where he's going, and they're like, oh, we're going to New Orleans, so they decide to give him a ride, because they ran him over. So, and he gives them some money, and fair enough, and he seems like a likable enough guy for the moment. So, excuse me, that's whenever we get to Newt, Texas. That they arrive there and they meet Mr. Farnsworth outside of this big gate, that is going to this estate. And Farnsworth is played by Richard Rickle, he's been in a ton of stuff. The main thing I always remember him from is whenever he was in Joe Dirt, and he's like, that Buffalo Bob guy. I heard that Buffalo Bob guy shoved a road flare up your bunghole. Hoorah! It's that guy, if you know who I'm talking about. But he's been in a bunch of stuff. I've seen him in all kinds of stuff. And he basically, he gives her the details, that Verna left this place to him. Verna Sawyer, left this place to him. And who is played by Marilyn Burns. I forgot to mention we see that, and again, she'll come back later on. But he explains everything that's going on. She left her estate, and she's forbidden from selling it. And he hands her this letter, and he's like, it's very important that you read this letter. It's very, very. He stresses it. It's very important that you read this letter. And she's, okay, whatever. And so he shows her the gate, the code gate, which is 0819, so August 19th is how he says to remember it. So there's a lot of nods to that August 19th. And he, as he leaves, he's telling her, make sure you read the letter, please read this letter. It's very important. And he maybe, what I would have done had I been in Farnsworth's position, to be honest with you, is I would have said, hey, look, I know your friends are here, but how about you send them to town, we go into the house, you sit down and we read this letter, and I'll kind of explain everything instead of being kind of cryptic as he's being, and, of course, everything else ensues. And again, we'll get back into that later. But, so they go into the house. The house is just beautiful. It's immaculate. When they go in, it's just this massive mansion, this Victorian mansion. It's beautiful, and they're just kind of checking everything out, and they see the pool table, and they decide to start partying. So they kick on some jams, and they're sitting there playing pool, and Heather just kind of continues to walk around the house, and that's when she finds the family cemetery. And when she goes back there, this is one thing I thought was really funny, is she goes and looks at all the gravestones. And so this is where we see the family. There was the Carson family, which is where Verna was married into, and then of course we have the Sawyer half. And so the sorry, not funeral, the graveyard was kind of split into two. So we have the Carson side again, like I said, and the Sawyer side. And on the Sawyer side, especially, that's where we see everyone has basically passed away on August the 19th. But the dates are always just very, conveniently covered. And that's kind of how it goes in this whole movie. Like, they'll show you August 19th all day long. They'll talk about August 19th this and August 19th that, but they will not say 1974. Like, period. It's just, I guess they don't want to admit that it was in 74. Why they couldn't have just said it a little bit further back, maybe said it in the 90s. I think they mainly did that because Alexandra Daddario is so young. But again, you could have just set it a little further back. That would have been fine. Even just I don't know, 5 or 6 years. It may have even made a little bit more sense, but I don't know. So that's one glaring thing that I think is really funny is that they keep covering up the year. So she anyway, side tangent. So anyway, she goes and she's basically checking everything out, and they decide that they're just going to stay there. So they decide to leave, and Daryl's like, nope, I'm overkilling this mission. I'm going to stay behind, and I'm going to, I'm going to unpack the bags. I'm going to get settled, get us all settled and all that. And they're just like, okay, yeah, sure, you can totally stay here at this house, guy that we've only known for less than 24 hours. You can totally stay here and crash, and we'll leave all the keys and everything with you while we go into town. And so as he's grabbing the bag, Nikki she says, "Oh, you're just a regular Boy Scout, aren't you?" And he's, "Of course." And so as soon as they drive off, he sits the bags down. He's like, "I'm a regular Boy Scout, all right." And then he proceeds to rip off the entire place. He's going in there grabbing anything he can find that's silver. He's grabbing it and just stuffing it in this little backpack thing that he has. And so he's getting everything that he possibly can. And so he finds this little hidden pantry in the kitchen. And when he goes down there, that leads to a small little wine cellar, and it's a really pretty little area. Again, this whole house is gorgeous. I love it. And so when he goes down there, he sees the big steel door, very reminiscent again of the '74 film. The big steel door that Leatherface had. And he's trying to get in this door, but he cannot. It won't budge. He's kicking it and slamming into it, and he's trying to pry it open with a knife, and he just can't get into it. So he leaves or turns around or something to get something else, and when he turns back around, Leatherface just comes out of nowhere and slams him in the face with a meat tenderizer and just tenderizes the hell out of his face. And we get a really nice practical effect, some really nice practical effects right here and in this whole movie. And then we also get some really horrible, awful CG, which we'll get into. But this effect looks really good when he's just pounding on his face, and he basically just makes hammer smash face out of Daryl. And so that's the last we see of him. And that's when we kind of see everyone in town, and we find out that Nikki and Ryan, Ryan's looking for something in the store, and Nikki kind of sneaks up behind him and grabs him by the dick, and he's like, "Hey, that was one time, and I had like 8 kamikazes." So we find out that they have fucked around before. He's been unfaithful to Heather, and Nikki is a shitty friend. So we find that out in this grocery store, and so and then we're just kind of flashing around town, seeing what all these guys are doing, and that's whenever Heather meets Carl, who is played, he's a sheriff's deputy, and he's played by Scott Eastwood. So that's when she meets him, and he's like, "You guys in town for the carnival or whatever?" And she's like, "No, we're here because I've inherited this Carson estate." And he's like, "Oh, are you a Carson?" And she says, "No," and he's like, "Oh, you're not a Sawyer, are you?" And she says, "Yeah, of course, that's the one." And that's when Bert comes over, and of course he's sitting there kind of flirting with her, and Bert comes over and he's like, "You want me to take this guy back and shoot him? I will. I'll shoot him for you." And then Carl, he means it. But anyway, so Carl kind of takes off, and Bert kind of starts asking her again, kind of same questions, and he's trying to get the house from her. He's like, I'll buy it off you right now. How much? And she's, not interested. And she leaves, and he's like, "Come on, give me a number. And she won't, abide. So they leave. They get back to the house, and when they get to, and sorry, before I get into that, I just want to say that the character of Bert Hartman, he's really doing a good job at being an asshole. Like, this guy, he's very unlikable in this movie. Paul Ray, like I said, he's doing a good job. I really don't like this character at all. He's a dick. But again, he's not wrong in a lot of ways that we'll get into. But so they get back, and they've realized that Daryl's ripped them off, and Heather's pissed off about it, and so they sit down and they drink some champagne, and they're like, "Oh, Nikki's so what? He lifted a few ashtrays and some silver candlesticks. You still got the whole house and all this. Not to mention that the keys are gone, and she's not really worried about that. I would be." And so they decide to just party it up. So and just say, "Screw it. We're not going to call the police or anything. We're just gonna party up. Or party down at this place." And so that's when Nikki's outside smoking a doobie. That's probably where I'd be too. Ryan's inside. He is playing pool. And Kenny is in the kitchen and he's cooking them steaks. So they're having a good night. Heather's just kind of wandering around the house and she sees this picture, which I guess is a painting of Verna, and that's where she sees the necklace, the little necklace with the S, the little S symbol, and she matches it up kind of with the little burn mark on her titty, and she, sorry, on her chest, I guess I should have said, but anyway, so she matches it up kind of with that burn mark, and that's when we get to Kenny, and that's whenever finds the he finds the little pantry hatch. And as he kind of goes down there, that's whenever he sees the blood trail, and he's like, Daryl, you down here? And so as he's coming down the stairs, Leatherface just pops up out of nowhere, stabs him in the back with a meat hook, and drags him down the stairs as he's screaming. And about that time, that's when we flash back to Nikki. She comes in the room and she's like, Ryan, oh my God, Ryan, you've got to come in here. You've got to see this. You've got to see this. It's so fucked up. It's so fucked up. And he's like, what? Oh, okay, So anyway, he takes off, and they're running outside, and they're running through the, they run into the barn, and they go to one of the stalls, and it's this huge, giant barn, and they go into one of the stalls, and there's a bucket, and she's like, it's right into that bucket, I swear. And so he flips the bucket over, and there's some liquor and some shot glasses and a blanket, and he turns around, and she's taking off her clothes, and she's like, I told you it was fucked up. So that's when we cut back to Heather, because they're going to do some nasty, stupid shit in the barn, really shitty, both really shitty people. So, and another thing too I'll say about that is they don't really do anything with that subplot just besides making them shitty characters. I guess that just makes it okay when they die. But Heather never really learned about this. I mean, I guess she put two and two together later on in the movie. We'll get into that again. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. So Heather is upstairs and she's in Verna's room and she's just looking around at everything, and that's when she sees Verna's corpse is laying in this chair, and she freaks out. She's like, oh my God. She runs downstairs. No one is anywhere to be found. She can't find Nikki. She can't find Ryan. And she hears a sound coming from in the kitchen. So she goes in there, and who, if anyone, it would be Leatherface standing there at the kitchen. And this is when we really get our first really good look at Leatherface. Like, we see him, in these last couple of kills, but it's real quick. So, but this time we see him very clearly, face in the camera, and he really doesn't look terrible. I mean, it doesn't look awful. It doesn't look great, but it doesn't look awful. Again, they captured lightning in a bottle with the first film. Leatherface's look has never looked better, in my opinion, than in the first movie. But he looks fine in this movie. I have no problems with the way he looks, at all in this scene. And he's basically standing at this sink, and he's cutting a finger off of a hand, and it kind of goes in slow motion, and he turns around. And that's when we see his face in the camera. And of course, Alexandra Daddario, she freaks out, she takes off running, and she falls and hits her head on this table, and she's unconscious. And so that's really their first meeting, in that. And again, that's when Leatherface is just kind of out of the bag. He's here now, and he's gonna fuck shit up. So she wakes up in the basement, and she's just kind of laying in the floor. Leatherface starts up his chainsaw, and he cuts Kenny in half. Kenny's hanging up, or he hangs him on a meat hook, I should say, and then Kenny kind of smacks him around, and it pisses Leatherface off, so he gets his chainsaw, cuts Kenny in half, and of course it's one of those cutaway shots where it goes up to Kenny's face, and then it'll cut to a torso, that is being cut in half with a chainsaw, and it looks great. I have no problem with it, and I'm really glad that they did that, actually, instead of just making everything CGI, because CGI stuff like that, really, I do not like it. It just never, to me, it never is better than a practical effect. I will always prefer practical effects over anything else, even if it is kind of cheesy and goofy like it is in this movie. It works great. I would say I love that. So cuts Kenny in half, and Heather just kind of gets up and takes off running, and she runs outside and into the graveyard where she finds Verna's casket, which is empty. So for some reason, she decides to lay down in that and just close the lid, like, she's just going to be safe and hidden, and nobody's ever going to find her. And of course, Leatherface comes directly out there, straight to the coffin, and he proceeds to cut it open while Heather's in there screaming and freaking out. So while this is going on, Nikki and Ryan hear this commotion from in the barn, and so they come out and they're like, "Hey, motherfucker, what's going on?" And so Leatherface is like, "Oh shit, more people." So then he takes off after them towards the barn. And so Nikki and Ryan, they get in the barn and they shut the doors and they put this piece of wood up, because wood's definitely going to stop the guy with the chainsaw. And so they didn't really have a choice, so can't fault them. But anyway, so they put this little board up, and Leatherface is cutting through it, and they're looking around the barn for something, and Nikki finds this shotgun, and she points to the door and says, "Welcome to Texas, motherfucker," and then blasts, which I think is a funny line because I kind of want to be like, y'all aren't even really from Texas, and he is from Texas, so you welcome to Texas, bitch. That's what he should have said with his chainsaw. Anyway, I just don't like them. I don't like their characters again because they're playing really shitty people, and we're supposed to not like them. That's kind of the point. But anyway, so Leatherface stops. And then we see headlights coming, and it's Heather, and she smashes through the barn door in the van, and that's when no questions asked. Nikki and Ryan, they jump in the van and they take off. And at no point was Heather like, "What were you guys doing in there, by the way?" But anyway, so Leatherface chases them. Ryan is driving, and they go to this. They go to the gate, the big gate that they come in, and the gate is automatic. Farnsworth tells him that, and so Ryan decides to do the stupid movie guy thing, and instead of stopping and waiting for the gate open, he just decides to floor it and slam into the gate and hopefully smash through it, and that doesn't work. It stalls out the van. So they're sitting there trying to restart the van. As they're doing this, of course, Leatherface is getting closer and closer and closer, which is actually a really, it could be a really tense scene if you hadn't gotten there because you're fucking stupid. But anyway, so it finally starts, the gate opens, and as they kind of come out of the gate, the car stalls again. Leatherface is, by this time caught up with them. By this time, if he would have just sat and waited again for the gate to open originally, they would have been home free completely. So Leatherface cuts the tire on the van. As Ryan is trying to drive away, they flip the van over, and that kills Ryan instantly. He's dead. Nikki and Heather are in the back of the van, and the van is kind of on its side, so that the sliding door is on the very top, above them, and they're laying on the ground, and Leatherface is attacking them in the van, and they're both bloody and beat up, and so Leatherface comes down through the top of the sliding door, and he slices Nikki's stomach open. And it's not super graphic. I mean, it sounds more graphic me describing it like that, but it's just real quick. He slices her open, and then Heather takes off running. And so Leatherface chases after her, and they run all the way to the little festival that Carl was talking about earlier. And so Heather climbs the fence. Leatherface cuts through the fence with his chainsaw and continues to chase her. And then we get this really fun scene that, a little bit of trivia, I guess, behind this. There's a little haunted house, kind of thing going on, and all these people are running out, and someone dressed up in the pig costume from the Saw movies comes out holding a little, kind of a toy chainsaw, chasing all these people around, and he comes face to face with Leatherface, who just kind of rears his chainsaw and, scares him off, and he takes off. Well, what was supposed to originally happen, I think, from what one of the writers said, is he wanted that to come out and Leatherface to slice right through him, as in saying, because again, this was produced by Lionsgate, as in, one franchise being the top dog, Leatherface, I'm Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I started this all, and we ripped through this franchise, this other franchise that wants to be like us. And I guess they didn't do that because, they didn't want to shit on their, Lionsgate didn't want them shitting on one of their other properties. So they didn't do that, but that would have been awesome. I really would have loved that. But instead, the Jigsaw guy, dressed up in that, leaves. He just runs away. And so Heather, instead of just kind of trying to find a crowd or trying to find somewhere else to hide, she grabs onto the Ferris wheel and is pulled up on the Ferris wheel as she's just hanging, hanging there. And Leatherface is just at the bottom waiting for her. And I'm like, well, that was dumb. You kind of deserve this now. No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, so as she's about to come back down, that's when Carl shows up. And he decides to, he screams at Leatherface, and he's like, "Hey, motherfucker, what do you do?" And so Leatherface turns around, and we get my least, okay, not my least favorite scene in the movie, probably my second least favorite scene in the movie, and that's when Leatherface turns around and he throws his chainsaw at the camera. This was an obvious 3D effect, but he throws his chainsaw at the camera, and it looks awful. It looks so bad. And I'm like, you really didn't have to do that. you really didn't have to do that at all. But they did. So anyway, Leatherface escapes. Carl gets Heather, and he takes her back to the police station, and they're kind of getting her report. Hooper's talking to her, Sheriff Hooper's talking to her, and she's, he was wearing a face, and that's when Carl pulls out the evidence box, and he's like, I've pulled up everything from the incident in 1974. I think he actually says 74, if I'm not mistaken, which is probably one of the only times it's actually, nailed down in this movie. But he kind of, he says that we found this evidence, and so that's when Bert Hartman shows up, who is now the mayor. By the way, I forgot to mention he's the mayor now. He was in, he was leading this squad of redneck folks, but now he's the mayor of this town. In '74, that's what he was doing, but now he's in the modern day. So he calls, Hooper into his office, or into another room, I should say, and he's like, they're like, it may be Jedediah Sawyer. That might be what's going on, and so around this time, that's when a cop shows up at the Carson estate, and he finds the wreck, and Hooper's telling him, he's like, wait for backup, don't go any further. But Hartman's pushing him. He's like, this is your mayor. I want you to go in there, and I want you to find out what's going on. And the cop pulls up his iPhone, and they video chat. So the whole time the cop's going through, this other cop is going through the house, he's got his phone, and he's video chatting with Bert Hartman, and Bert's telling him where to go. And he's following this blood trail, which was from Nikki being dragged back, Nikki being dragged back into the house. And so while he's following this, it leads him all the way down these stairs, and he goes through. It finally leads him to the basement, to the metal door. And so he's looking around, and he's following this blood trail, and it comes to this freezer, and then we get kind of a callback to the '74 film where Nikki's, Nikki, not her body, but she, pops out of the freezer and scares the cop. The cop shoots her right in the head, and her brains splatter all over the back of this freezer. And he's like, oh my God, and of course there's corpses and flies and just everything everywhere. And he's already freaking out. He's on edge. And so Hartman's like, oh my God, it didn't happen. It's okay. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. And so Hooper's freaking out. And he's like, you've got to get him out of there. We cannot, this is ridiculous, And so about that time, the call fails. The cop goes back upstairs, he's going to leave, and Leatherface comes out and attacks him with an axe and gets him, in the shoulder, and he's chopping him in the back. Again, this looks great. These effects are looking just fine. It's nothing over the top, but it is fairly violent and very gory. But it's not, it's again, it looks fine. I have no issues with how any of this looks. So he kills him. We go back to the police station, and that's when Bert Hartman and Sheriff Hooper, they come back into the room where Heather was, and they see that she's gone through the evidence, because while they were in there doing that, she was looking through all this evidence, and she was reading everything that had happened that night, and basically now is looking at Bert Hartman as the bad guy, and her family's as being, him being a murderer of their family. And so there's this photograph that was taken of all of them, that night when the house was burned down. They're all standing there. One guy's holding the chainsaw up, this guy's holding a severed leg, and Bert Hartman's sitting right in the middle with his gun. And so Heather has written murderers right across the front of this, And so I guess, they head out to get her. She is wandering in the streets, and she's got this shirt that Carl gave her to change into, and she's only wearing like the top 3 buttons, so her tits are almost falling out, and it's just really funny, and guys are hooting and hollering at her, in the street and stuff. And so she goes to a payphone. Anybody remember those? Remember them payphones back then? Actually they still were kind of going away in that day. I'm really surprised there was one in this movie. I think payphones should actually make a comeback. I think they're really handy. I think there should be pay. I don't have a cell phone myself. I mean, I have a cell phone, but it doesn't work, and I think that payphones would just be really handy to still have around. Anyway, off topic, but so she calls Farnsworth on a payphone, and he says meet me. He says meet me at Johnny B. Red's. It's a bar, not too far from you. So they meet there, and he basically explains, he tells her, he's like, did you read the letter? Did you read the letter? And she's like, no, of course I didn't read the letter, because you told me to, and I really should have, but I didn't. And so that's when Farnsworth really lays it all down. And he explains to Heather that basically the man in the basement is Jedediah Sawyer, which is her cousin, and that he is, a child in a grown man's body, and he, is basically just protecting his home. the last time a girl got away, he lost his entire family, so he's not going to let that happen again, and he's not going to stop following her and trying to kill her until he gets it or gets her, So he kind of breaks all that down for her, and it kind of works, but it kind of doesn't in a way. I think it's just, and so I don't know. Anyway, I'll just move on from that. So he kind of tells her everything. So if she would have just read this letter at the very beginning of all this, it would have saved a lot of trouble. So anyway, while they're in there, Bert shows up with Carl and this other guy named Ollie, I think is. No, I'm sorry, Carl's not there. Bert shows up with another guy named Ollie, I think is his name. And that's when they they're trying to grab her and they end up beating up on Farnsworth a little bit. And Heather runs outside and she takes off running. She runs into Carl. And so Carl picks her up and she's like, "We got to go back to the bar. They attacked me and they've attacked Farnsworth and we've got to go back and help him." And so she gets in the car with him and they're headed back to the bar. And he drives past the bar, and that's whenever he gets a phone call, and it's Bert Hartman, and he says, "You got that Sawyer girl? Why don't you take her out to the whole slaughterhouse?" And that's when he says, "Whatever you say, Dad." He's very obvious about it. So that's when we find out that that's his son, and so she's screwed now, and so she flips out, and she's super pissed off, and they're kind of arguing in the car and going about their business. And back at the house, we flash back to the Carson house. That's where we see oh no, sorry, I forgot to mention something else. They're in the car and they're arguing, and excuse me, they get to a certain point where Heather's like, "You're a Hartman, huh?" And he says, "Yeah." And she sticks a knife through the back of this little police kind of cage thing that's on the back of police cars, and she says, "I'm a Sawyer." So so she's accepted her Sawyerism now. Even though her family were horrible, violent murderers, nothing thicker than blood, as Daryl says in the beginning of this movie. But so anyway, that I thought that was a silly line to have in this movie, and I thought it was kind of silly how the plot was starting to kind of lean this way. That really kind of took me out of it, especially back then, and now it just kind of makes me laugh. So anyway, back at the house at the Carson estate, Leatherface is down there and he's cutting off the cop's face, and he hangs it up on this little hook, and he goes over to that photograph that I was mentioning earlier, and he crosses this cop's face off of the photo because he was there, which I think is dumb, because it turns into a silly kind of revenge plot that we really didn't need. We did not need any of this revenge plot at all, and the reason that they do this is they try too much to make Leatherface into Jason. Way too hard, or a Michael Myers character. That is not what Leatherface is. Even in the original film, he's not. Leatherface was never the focal point of the original film. Even if the original title of the script was named after him, he was not necessarily the main guy. It was really a whole bunch of things working in conjunction that made the first film work so well. It wasn't just Leatherface. So films that really focus on just Leatherface, that's the ones that kind of lose it for me. And so anyway, that's where this one starts to get a little bit dumb, is whenever it starts focusing on this kind of revenge plot. And that's when Leatherface, he is moving the car out to, the police car that the guy came in, and he's moving that into the garage, or I'm sorry, into the barn. And that's whenever he hears over the radio, Bert Hartman tells him, "Hey, we're taking the Sawyer girl to the slaughterhouse, meet us there." Because they haven't heard back from him, haven't bothered to investigate or anything. So that's when Leatherface goes back into his little workshop, and he changes his mask, and we get a little glimpse of, the lower part of his face, and he changes into this mask that actually looks really cool. I like the look of it. I think I like this one a little bit better than the mask he was wearing at the beginning of the movie. So he changes into this mask, and they do this really cool thing where he actually sews the mask to his face through his cheek, and it's a really awesome little effect that they do, and I really like that. Just that little detail in there worked so well for me. The fact that Leatherface stitches this mask to his own face, so that it's fully a part of him. I love that. I love that little detail. I wish they would, they could have expanded on that in the past movies, or had done something with that in the past movies. Love that. So he does that. He grabs his chainsaw and his tie, and he takes off. He leaves and heads to the slaughterhouse. And then, of course, Farnsworth, he goes and he alerts Hooper, of the plan, and that's when they see on this little map thing that tracks, the police cars, that he's going out to the slaughterhouse. So they decide to take off. Not they, sorry. Hooper decides to take off after them. And so he goes out there. When we get back to the slaughterhouse, when we finally get to the slaughterhouse, Carl ties Heather up inside, and he goes back outside and waits for Bert. And so while he's outside, Leatherface arrives, and he comes up behind Heather. And I remember this shot from the trailer specifically because I thought this was a really cool shot. But he comes in, and she's tied up, and she's got her arms hanging above her head. Basically, she's kind of strung up, and her titties are about to fall out. Her shirt's wide open, and Leatherface comes over, and he puts the chainsaw right over her shoulder. And I remember that scene, from the trailer, and I just remember that exciting me very much. And so when he does that, he comes around, he starts the chainsaw, and he's about to stab her in the chest, and that's when he notices the birthmark on her chest. And that's when he puts two and two together, cuts, and he takes the tape off of Heather's mouth, and she's like, "It's me, it's Heather, it's your cousin," So he frees Heather. Heather takes off. And that's when Bert and Ollie, they arrive, and Bert tells Carl, "This is no place for a cop, boy," and sends him on his way. And so they go inside. They proceed to beat the shit out of Leatherface. They're beating the crap out of him. Heather's leaving, and as she's leaving, she hears Leatherface scream, and she's, "I can't leave him behind. He's family." So she turns back around, goes back inside. So they take this chain, Bert and Ollie, and they wrap it around Leatherface's neck, and it's connected to this big kind of meat grinder, kind of like that, sort of like that thing from Saw 3, sort of. It's like a meat pulverizer basically, and it's slowly dragging Leatherface towards this. And so when they split, Hartman is sitting there still beating the shit out of Leatherface. Ollie heads off to go turn this device on, or this machine on. And after he turns it on, Heather comes up behind him and stabs him with a pitchfork and kills him, again. So she's accepted her killer side. The killer in me is the killer in you. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. I really don't even like Smashing Pumpkins, to be honest with you. I like that song. Anyway, I'm sorry. I hope anyone who's listening to this is enjoying. I'm sure enjoying making it. Anyway, so Heather kills this guy, and that's when she goes back, and we get the worst. So earlier when I was talking about that's probably the second worst line or worst scene in the movie. This is the worst one. But it makes me laugh so hard, and it's so stupid. This killed the whole movie for me when I first watched it, in 2013. And so Heather comes in, and she picks up the chainsaw, and she says, "Hey," and Bert turns around, and Leatherface looks at her, and he's still chained up, and he's trying to get himself out of these chains, and she throws the chainsaw past Bert. It lands in front of Leatherface, and he picks it up, and she says, "Do your thing, cuz." And it's a face palm moment, like, oh my God, what did you really have to do that? It's so laughable. It makes me laugh every time. It's so stupid. Just do your thing, cuz. I'm like, I really wish you guys hadn't have put that in there. No, I didn't like it. Didn't like that line of dialogue. I thought it was so stupid. So Hartman and Leatherface are fighting. Leatherface is free now, and they're sitting there, and they're going at it. Hartman's got like a crowbar or something, and they're just sword fighting basically. Leatherface slices Hartman's ankle, and Hartman falls down, and Leatherface is kind of poking at him with the chainsaw as Hartman's kind of crawling backwards, and then he's hanging over the side of this meat grinder thing that Leatherface was getting dragged to, and he's hanging there. He's got his hands holding onto this chain, and that about that time, that's when Sheriff Hooper comes in, and Hooper's watching them, and he's like, Hooper, help me, get me out of here, do the right thing, kill him. And so that's when Leatherface slices, he cuts both of Bert Hartman's hands off at the wrists. Looks awful. That doesn't look as bad as when Bert falls into the meat grinder, and then he falls in and he's shredded up into a million pieces. That looks terrible. I really wish they would have done something a little bit different with that. That just looks so bad. And this movie, like I said, had some really good practical effects. I mean, they weren't like groundbreaking or anything, but I love practical effects, and they were doing really well with them in this movie until kind of the latter half. It's like they got got lazy or something, it seems. But that just looked so bad, and that oh my god, it was awful. So that kind of sucked. So after he falls in, Leatherface kicks his hands, kicks Hartman's hands off into back, further down into the meat grinder, because they were still hanging onto this chain, which is that's a funny little thing. I was okay with that. Just the leading up to it was silly, and so that's when Hooper decides to put his gun away, and he's like, "Can't get around the good book, Bert." So he brings that line back, and then he looks at Heather and Leatherface and Heatherface. Yeah, they're Heatherface. That's funny. I just thought about that. And he says, "Clean this shit up," and just leaves. No further investigation. Nobody's going to ask any questions why the mayor has been murdered. The son's not going to ask where his dad is. Nobody's going to ask any questions. It's fine. Nobody's going to come looking for her friends. Anything like that. So Hooper just leaves. So that's silly. When you really break it down and actually say it sounds even funnier. So back at the Carson house, Heather finally decides to read the letter, and that's when we see Marilyn Burns. We kind of go back to a flashback with, or not flashback, but more of like a, I guess you could say that, because Marilyn Burns, her character Verna is dead at this point, but she's writing the letter, and she's basically describing everything to Heather, describing the situation, telling her who Jed is, and that he needs her care, and yada yada yada. And so I really like that scene that we get Marilyn Burns in here, and that she's not just shoved in your face. Like, she's here, but she wasn't, like, again, crammed down your throat like the character of Sally Hardesty in general was pushed down your throat in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022. So I really like seeing her. And, so she, in this letter, she gets a necklace, the little Sawyer necklace. And like I said, she reads this letter that explains everything. And so that's when she decides to basically, she's going to take care of Jed. He goes back downstairs, and she picks up his plate of food that he'd eaten, and implying she's going to go upstairs and get him a new plate. And so she shuts the door to the basement, and Leatherface slams the steel door, and then we get the credits. So yeah, that's kind of what I thought was silly in this whole, is like, if you would have just read this letter that Farnsworth specifically told you to read, and he was harping on it big time, all of your friends would still be alive. I don't really see why you're wanting to care for this person who still murdered all of your friends, even if they were bastards. You didn't really know that. You weren't aware of what was going on. But, he still killed a bunch of people, and he was going to cannibalize them. And just, he's family, so, we're going to take care of him. So I just thought that was really funny. That really kind of takes me out of the plot. And oh yeah, I forgot to mention. So I didn't actually know about this for many years. I didn't see it when I first watched the movie. But several years later. So I thought I would talk about it. I made sure to write it down in my notes. But so she at the end of, we get an after credits scene, and so, which I thought was really funny. I didn't expect one at all. I think I was just reading about the movie one day, and I saw that there was an after credits scene, and I'd never seen it before. This was probably 2-3 years ago at this point. So I sat down, watched the movie, made it to the after credits, and so basically at the end of the movie, we see Heather's parents, her adopted parents. They come and they ring the doorbell of the house, of the Carson estate, and the door flies open, and they're kind of talking shit like, "Oh, she's, she's got money now," and blah blah blah. And so the door flies open, and Leatherface comes out with his chainsaw, and then we just cut to black. So that's the after credit scene. It's not much, and it's not even really worth your time if you don't want to, but I just thought it was fun that it was in there, and that I didn't know about it for so long, and that, again, I just found out about it just a couple of years ago. So I thought that was funny. So that is Texas Chainsaw 3D, or Texas Chainsaw, if you want. That's what I'm going to title it. I'm going to title it Texas Chainsaw 3D in the on the title of this episode. But yeah, it's, despite all of its problems, and like I said, most of the problems I have with it are towards the end. This movie is basically Castle Freak, but with a Texas Chainsaw Massacre spin, which I think is funny. That's how I'd usually describe it. That's kind of what's going on. That same sort of premise, and it does some good thing. It does some things right, and it is a fun watch. But I feel like they were just trying to do too much with it. Like the whole revenge plot, I don't really think we needed that at all. We could have done away with that. There and like I said, there's some really good practical effects in this movie. Leatherface looks just fine, and there's some really bad CGI. But some great practical effects. Leatherface looks good. He's very convincing as Leatherface. This is probably out of the newer Texas Chainsaws that we're getting, like this one, the movie Leatherface from 2017, Texas Chainsaw 2022, this is probably my favorite out of those, and it's my favorite Leatherface, most definitely. And of course, Leatherface from 2017, that is a prequel to this movie, which we'll talk about that maybe at some point. I don't really care for that one very much at all, but that one is a prequel to this movie and kind of explains some things and wraps up some loose ends. But again, my main gripes with this movie is, for example, at the very end, Hooper can leave and everything, but like there's still a lot of explaining to do. A lot of people are going to wonder what's going on, and they're going to put two and two together, and it's going to lead them back to your house. And so, that's kind of silly, and the whole plot with, you could have just read this letter and saved a lot of time and life, basically. And Farnsworth, maybe if he would have said something a little bit, gotten, lit a fire under her ass or something, gotten on her about it, at the very beginning, maybe maybe it's Farnsworth's fault. Maybe it's not just Heather's fault, but I'm still blaming Heather. But anyway, so that is Texas Chainsaw 3D. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoy this movie. If you haven't seen it, check it out. I think it's fine. It's a legacy sequel, of course, to the original film. That it's kind of becoming a commonplace thing nowadays. They're doing a lot of, but I think this is one of the first ones that I remember, if I'm not mistaken. It's probably one of the first legacy sequels I remember being around, and being aware of the legacy sequels thing. Anyway, until next time, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and stay tuned for the next one, and goodbye.